Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. Today's library talk is entitled Spiritual Formation in the Digital Age. And we're delighted to have you in attendance. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we have right over here to my right a table where you can sign up to win some books that we're giving away today. The books are Dr. Schatzer's Faithful Learning, his book Transhumanism and the Image of God, and we'll let you talk a little bit about what that means here in a few minutes, and a book that our library staff has read this year, a book by a man named Sam James on the idea of spiritual formation, a book called Digital Liturgies. And so if you want to sign up for those, it's right over here. Our library here at Southeastern, we exist to engage the Southeastern community with services and resources to equip you to serve the church and fulfill the Great Commission. And library talks like this one are just part of that. It's part of one of the ways that we try to fulfill our mission. We intend for these talks to be places where the academic community can kind of come together, foster growth, by bringing students together and engage in a wide variety of topics and to assess their relevance for Christian ministry. And so we are really thankful you're here. And so let's introduce our speaker today. To my left over here is Dr. Jacob Schatzer. And I'm just going to read this outright so that I don't mangle it. Dr. Schatzer is the Associate Professor of Theological Studies at Union University. He was recently named Provost of Union University, and he's been serving as Associate Provost and Dean of Instruction. He received his education at Union University, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Marquette University. He teaches Bible, theology, and ethics, and has written on topics ranging from theological hermeneutics to transhumanism to the integration of faith and learning. And he's married to Keisha. They have 4 children, and he's a 4th-generation Chicago Cubs fan and enjoys running. So let me just back up. A 4th-generation Chicago Cubs fan.
Uh-huh, yeah.
What? So I'm a 2nd-generation Atlanta Braves fan.
Okay.
And so when I think about 4th generation, I think of my great grandfather, right? That's going all the way back to him. We were the Boston Bean Eaters back when he would have been watching. So what does it feel like to be a Cubs fan for that long?
Yeah, it's a significant part of my family identity, I think. Yeah, it goes all the way back to my great-grandparents who were farm hands on farms in northern Missouri and in Iowa, and Cubs games were free on the radio. And so they became Cubs fans. They raised my grandfather to be a Cubs fan, who raised my father to be a Cubs fan, who raised me to be a Cubs fan. And I lived in Kansas for a little while. I taught at a little college there, and when my oldest son started school, he went to kindergarten, public school. He came home from school one day. We're sitting at dinner and eating what you do at dinner. And my wife says, "Hey, Zeke, why don't you tell Dad what you told me when you came home from school today?" And he looks up at me and he says, "I'm a Cardinals fan."
Oh, wow.
And I set my fork down and I said, "Do you want to be part of this family or not?" And we fixed that over dinner. And by the end of that year, all his buddies at school were Cubs fans, and we moved around. He's been converting people to being Cubs fans everywhere we've gone. And he really did put his dues in. They didn't win the World Series right away. He had a few seasons of disappointment as a young child, and so I was glad for that, multiple seasons of disappointment since.
If you're going to be a Cubs fan, you've got to kind of get used to that.
Yeah, there's a theological virtue to being a Cubs fan. You're getting more than you bargained for here with this question. Waiting in hope for things not seen. Maybe next year is a great thing to live by, because see, it's not saying certainly next year. It doesn't get your hopes too high. It's just maybe.
Maybe
next year.
That's a good way to live.
No.
As a Braves fan, just growing up as a Braves fan, I love the Cubs for a couple of reasons. they were on WGN every day, right? Yep. And so you could watch the Cubs in the afternoon, and then when it would get time for the Braves game at night, you knew when it was going to be. You had Turner time, and you could cut that on. But then also, I just appreciate the Cubs because they've given us like Greg Maddux.
Yeah, a lot of good players that they, let other teams have.
Jock Peterson. And it's all been at like great times. So yeah, I still, I do. I kind of have a soft spot in my heart for them because of that. So spiritual formation, that's what we're talking about today. So to get us started, I just wanted to start with a kind of a quote from one of your books, or a story. And this is from your book. Faithful Learning, and it's from the introduction. You said this. You said, "While I do not remember off the top of my head the first book that I purchased from Amazon, Amazon, of course, does. I placed the order on December 9th, 2002, and it included a book filled with authors who would change my life, not only through their writings, but later through their teaching and investment in me. The book, Shaping a Christian Worldview, The Foundations of Christian Higher Education. When I placed the order, I was a 16-year-old high school senior hoping to study at Union University." So as I was thinking about just this discussion today, one of the things that cropped into my mind was, in terms of spiritual formation, what happened in your life that you were a 16-year-old wondering about what are the foundations of Christian higher education? How did the Lord bring you kind of to that point and form you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I felt called to ministry in 8th grade. I don't remember what the message was at youth group or what, but I know that I went forward, felt the call to ministry. I didn't really know what that meant. I assumed it meant I was going to be a youth pastor. I did that for a bit and really enjoyed that. But that meant as I went through high school, even though I got pretty good grades in high school, as you might expect from somebody who's a provost now, the school is something I liked and enjoyed and did well at. But I knew that I was called to ministry, so I was consistently I wanted to go to a Bible college or a Christian university. I'm also a first-generation college student, and my mom stayed home. So we didn't have a lot of money. There was not an obvious way that this was going to happen. And so I applied to Moody Bible Institute and got in there because it's free tuition there. So, and that was close to home for me. I grew up in eastern Iowa. And then I learned about Union University at a college fair that fall. Okay. There's actually one more step to this. Part of what I was doing through high school as I was feeling called to ministry is I was kind of trying to get a lot of my high school requirements done early so that I would be able to do an internship with my youth pastor during my senior year. So I had packed a lot into my freshman and sophomore year, and then going into my junior year, which was going to be, I was going to finish most of my coursework, so my senior year I could do an internship in the church, found out that my youth pastor was planning to leave and pastor in another place. And so it's kind of at this spot where I thought I knew what God was calling me to do. I was kind of lining things up. And so part of the reason I was a 16-year-old high school senior was because I had been orienting my life around trying to do this internship that kind of didn't work out. And so by that time, I'd figured out that I could graduate a year early because of the groundwork I had laid for that internship. So I was trying to graduate early, and I found out about Union, and I applied, and Union still to this day, has a really good scholarship, a merit-based scholarship program. At that time, they would bring about 80 to 100 students in for a weekend for a scholarship competition. And so I got that book because I was trying to prepare for that scholarship competition. Wow. Now we have that over 2 weekends and bring about 240 students onto campus for that same scholarship competition. But yeah, so that was kind of I was just trying to be obedient to what I thought God's calling was. And for me, I don't know where all you did your undergrad. I could have gone to the University of Iowa. That was the local major university for me, a really good school. I could have gone to a Christian university and majored in something different. I had a lot of friends. I ran into people at Union when my freshman year who were doing that. They're like, well, God's called me to ministry, but I'm going to get a business degree first. And maybe that was your story. I don't mean to criticize anybody who did that. But I remember thinking, wait a second. If I do that and then I graduate with a business degree, I might be tempted not to obey my calling to ministry because I know that I would make a lot more money with a business degree. So I was like almost afraid to let myself do that because I was afraid that it would make disobedience more possible. So I knew that God was calling me to some sort of ministry. And so even though I could have gotten a good scholarship to go to a public university, even though I could have majored in all sorts of different things at a Christian university, I knew just deep, even though I didn't know what exactly it was going to mean, I knew that God was calling me to study the Bible and study theology, even though that didn't make sense to a lot of people that were speaking into my life. Yeah. My parents were always supportive, which is great, and church folks, but outside of that, it didn't make sense.
Sure. That's great. That's great. A similar experience. I went to North Greenville University, which is a Christian school. And for me, I was saved as a 21-year-old. And it was the next year. I went when I was 22. And discipleship and formation really, in a lot of ways, happened in the classroom as I met these professors and spent time with them, and they just poured into me. So just thanking God for those types of institutions. So when we think about spiritual formation, how would you define that? What is spiritual formation in kind of your thinking, and even how you think about it as a provost now at Union?
Yeah, so I guess I would want to have maybe a broad and a narrow definition of spiritual formation. The broad definition being spiritual formation is just all the ways in which we are our spirituality, our whatever word we want to use for that insideness is shaped into the image of Christ. And I want to use anyway because I think there are a lot of things, part of where it connects in with technology, there are a lot of things that maybe we don't think of as spiritual formation issues that are actually rubbing up against spiritual formation issues and are serving to form us. That was part of the reason I wanted to study and write on transhumanism, was related to that. So I think there's a broad definition, but there's also a more narrow definition, which tends to be centered around when we do that on purpose, seeking spiritual formation by trying to connect with God and His Word through various practices and things like that. And I think it's really important to have both of those definitions, because if you only have the narrow one, you can be blind to the ways that you're being spiritually formed in a variety of ways. But if you only have the broad one, you can miss that God has given us these gifts and ways to draw near to Him that have been consistent through Christian history, whatever technologies or opportunities there are.
So in that narrow way, you're really seeking to kind of walk in ways of faithfulness. Seems like what you're saying.
Yeah.
And in the broader sense, is that limited to, is that type of spiritual formation, is it limited to Christians? Or are there other examples of the types of ways that people can be formed that you can think of?
Yeah, I think that to be human is to be an embodied soul. And so whether you've submitted your life to Christ or not, you're being formed as the type of being that you are. So I think spiritual formation is inescapable. And so a lot. It doesn't go under, typically it's Christians that use that language primarily. So often when you're using that language, you're operating more in a Christian realm. But I think it's something that everybody is doing. When I talk to prospective students, they're thinking about coming to Union, and they're thinking about maybe going to a neutral school, a state school or something like that. I say, look, you're going to be formed there. It's not the question of should I go to a Christian school and be formed, or should I go to a different school and not be formed. Just because they're not talking as much about spiritual formation doesn't mean it's not happening. And so I think that the types of beings that we are mean that we're going to be spiritually formed. Even our physical practices form us in spiritual ways because we're unified beings.
So I'm just curious, if you were talking to someone, let's say that was coming from more of an atheistic perspective or an agnostic perspective, and they were to say to you, I don't even believe in a spirit. I don't see how that's the case at all. How would you respond to kind of that sort of pushback?
It would probably depend on the degree to which I knew them and had a relationship with them. When you know someone, then I think you can point out things where you say, okay, you think you're not a spiritual being, but you can kind of push on those things. If it's someone that you don't know relationally, I don't know to what degree like a theoretical argument about the body soul issue or that sort of thing is really going to compel someone.
Sure.
So yeah, but I think that most people experience, like, however they label that experience of falling in love with things. I think ultimately, whether that's that we're drawn to people through friendship and romance. There's those things. I think people recognize there's something deeper there. Or like, when the Cubs won the World Series in 2016,
right.
I had all 4 of my children up. It was like 12:30 in the morning in Florida where we lived at the time. And I remember that, and there's something deeper than just the physical there. Not to loop back to that or pull there, but I think that even people who want to deny spiritual formation, when they actually look back at the most meaningful portions of their lives, I think they have to acknowledge that there's something there. And if they want to be physical minimalists about that and just say it was just a chemical reaction, I don't know that you can argue them out of that. But I think that I don't think they're actually satisfied with that answer either.
Yeah, you mentioned the Cubs thing. I still remember sitting up and watching that game. You had the delay. You had the finish of the game.
Yep, the delay, we put our kids to bed and we got them back up.
And I did the same thing. Fell asleep. I'm not even a Cubs fan. But just knowing the history there,
yeah.
How can you not feel joy?
I don't know. I'm sure there's somebody out here who felt no joy.
Dr. Quinn, did you feel joy?
Zero joy.
Zero joy. That's great. That's great. So what should spiritual formation look like according to Scripture and the Christian tradition? How do you think that should look for people?
Yeah, so there are, of course, all kinds of classic books on this sort of thing, Richard Foster, Donald Whitney on spiritual disciplines especially. So when I think of spiritual formation, I think of spiritual disciplines right away, talking about that intentional type of approach to it. And I think that the central idea is if sanctification means that God has promised that he is going to make me into the image of his Son, how can I draw near to Jesus? Jesus is the Word made flesh, so drawing near to the Word of God is an obvious way that we should seek spiritual formation. And so regularly reading and memorizing Scripture by ourselves, but also in church community is key, drawing near to God in prayer. And I think that keeping it that simple, now there are other practices and things that help with spiritual formation. I don't want to deny those, but I think that the word and prayer and worship are central. And I think that setting those as central is really vital for these conversations when it comes to thinking about technology, because I think right away when we think about how we engage technology with those practices, we find ways that technology might help those, but if we're honest, we also find ways that technology can distract from those.
Good. Could you say just a word or two about kind of individual Christian formation versus communal Christian formation? What that would look like, and even how now you're working with students on a regular basis. How would you encourage them to make sure that they're participating in both of those?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of been a swing back and forth over the last 20 years from individualism to the importance of community. And I think that for many folks like myself who grew up I grew up in a solid church tradition, but it was still very much the good churches that I went to still really emphasized like personal responsibility. You need to trust Jesus. You need to do this. You need to read your Bible. You need to pray. You need to share your faith. So there was a lot of individualistic elements to it. And it was kind of like, well, we just happen to be doing this together, and sometimes we get together for youth group and go on trips in big vans. And so I remember in college and seminary becoming more familiar with some of the work pointed to the importance of the community and really finding that significant and important, but not because I don't matter as an individual or because I don't need to relate to God as an individual, but because of what the New Testament teaches about the church as the body of Christ. And Paul doesn't say the parts don't matter. There's still individual parts. Like even in the metaphor itself, I think it balances that individualism and that group identity. So I do this in a couple of ways with students. One, did I have you for Christian doctrine? You might remember this. One that I do in my Christian doctrine class when I talk about the doctrine of the church is I make the point that there's a lot of students. Well, Union has a lot of good churches around it, so a lot of students are in church. So the first thing I always do is, and we do this as a university, students should be members of a local church or connected in at a local church and serving, not just hopping around.
Amen.
Campus ministry is not a substitute for the church. But still, I think people still think it's like normal for Christians to not be connected to the church. And so I do an illustration when I talk about ecclesiology. I ask my students to close their eyes, and then I walk them through a little bit of a story. I say, you've entered, usually this class is taught on the third floor of an academic building. I say, okay, you've walked in for class, all right? You walked in that side door, you came up the stairs, you're coming up the stairs, you open the door to the hallway to come to our classroom, and there on the floor in front of you is a severed toe. And yeah, that's what I get. I get a face like that. Do you remember that? Yes. Good illustrations are memorable. And so it gets this kind of factor. And why do you have that? Because you and me, if you see a severed toe laying there on the ground, you know something has gone very wrong. You may have a variety of responses. If you know that it's good for a severed toe to be put on ice because maybe that will help it be able to be reattached to this toeless person hobbling around somewhere, maybe you're going to go look for ice. I don't know. Maybe you're going to run the other direction. You're going to do something, right? Seeing a severed toe, you know something's not right. But on Sunday morning, even on a Christian college campus like Union University, there are a whole bunch of severed toes still sleeping in their dorm rooms when church starts. And we don't tend to have the same attitude towards that, even though if they're believers, then they are meant to be part of a body. And so seeing a chopped off body part it should startle us, and it doesn't anymore. And so that's maybe a bit grotesque of a way to make that point, but I think it's helpful to help us remember that both of those are important. The toe still needs to be a toe. There's an individualism to it, but it also ideally is connected to a body.
That's a great point. It also gives us a great hashtag to use whenever we distribute the video. Just hashtag severed toes.
Yep.
That'll fit in really well. So let me just ask this: what are some of the most significant challenges to healthy spiritual formation that you see now and that you expect maybe in the future?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with spiritual formation, I think, just when I look at myself, but also when I look at people around me and when I look at my children, is much of what we are called to do with spiritual discipline as we seek our formation requires us to pay attention to things. Whether that's listening to, even if it's just listening to someone tell you how God is working in their lives. Or back, I don't know, Baptist churches used to always the fifth Sunday would be testimony night.
Right.
It was hymn request night and testimony night.
Absolutely.
My church doesn't do that anymore. I kind of wish they'd bring it back. I was always trying to throw the hymn in that I didn't think the organist would know.
God of earth and outer space.
That's there you go. And then there's always some risk when you've got an open mic and you're share your testimony, because you just never know where it's going to go. But actually, I think we lose something when we try to tame that too much. So even if it's just paying attention to someone that you're oh great, there goes so-and-so again for testimony night. Who knows what they're going to, listening to them though, and hearing how God is working in their lives, or listening to a sermon that's more than 15 minutes long and it's not a TikTok video, or reading the Bible, long time in one sitting. When I had my Gospels class in seminary, Jonathan Pennington made us read, when you had to read Matthew, you could not just bits and pieces it. He was you got to find a time you can sit down and read the whole book of Matthew, because Matthew's one book, and you're going to see things when you read the whole book in a row that you're going to miss if you don't do it. So you got to do that. That's hard to do, but it doesn't really take that long. We should be able to pay attention for that long. So I just think one of the challenges is that we need to be able to pay attention. And so much about our information economy now, especially when it comes to digital technology, works on fracturing our attention into bits, distracting us, and monetizing our distraction. And so that's just how the economy of digital technology works. Even setting aside, how much time should we spend on it? The fracturing of attention, I think, is key. So even though a lot of folks now will use the Bible on the phone, because they've got their phone in their pocket. You don't have to carry your Bible to church. I still really, I don't think I have a Bible app on my phone. And it's not because I'm holier than you if you have it. It's because I'm distractible, very distractible. I think you probably are too. It's important to me to be able to read my Bible in something that's not going to have a text message pop up from my mom. You know, I love my mom. It's great when she texts me. But like, I need to be able to focus. And the phone is not built for me to focus. It's an ecosystem that's constructed to deliver convenience, but also to distract. And so I think that's a big challenge. And that's going to be a challenge it's not just for people who say, I love the hottest, newest gadgets. It's a challenge for all of us now because it's really hard to opt out of that system completely. And whatever level you've opted into it is going to challenge the difficulty of attention.
So what are the ways that you would challenge your students, or you've got 4 kids, you know, you're a dad. What are the ways that you would challenge them to make sure that they're being aware of that and that they understand that ecosystem that they're in that's trying to draw their attention? What do you say? Yeah,
I think the key word, you stole my answer, is just awareness at some level. Like a lot of times we go to extremes. We're like, oh, well, you can't completely avoid. Like, what kind of life can you live? Bury your head in the sand, Luddite. Or just, it's like the option is that, or just ignore it and do everything. And really, I think what we need to do as believers, as parents, as friends, is try to be aware of how our engagement with technology is engaging us in trade-offs constantly. And I use that intentionally because we all know that there are like objectively good things that technology enables. I made the joke about getting a text from my mom. I'm in much better communication with my mother, who lives 8 hours away from me, because of technology and other members of my family. And that can be a good thing, right? I can think about the trade-offs of that. But there's something that's given up as well with some of the conveniences that we have. It's more difficult for me to pay attention to my children when I'm in a room that has my phone and my phone makes noises at me. And I have to be aware of that. And sometimes, like one thing I've been trying to do lately is to just disobey my phone better. Like, let it make its noise. It does not rule me. I'll go look at it when I want to. And because I realize that it's probably not that important, but there's just this compulsion when you hear it to check it. And the trade-off there is missing whatever it is that you're focusing on and paying attention to. Now, there are times when you know something important might happen and you need to do it.
Right.
But trying to be aware of the trade-offs of connectivity. For me in worship currently, I try not to take my phone to church if I can remember not to. And I've just kind of set a rule for myself recently. If I am in chapel at the university for worship, or if I'm in a worship service at church, I'm not touching the phone. If it's buzzing away in my pocket, it's waiting. Because even if there's some kind of major tragedy going on, like I'm not Superman, I'm not changing that. And actually there's a deeper and truer reality happening in that worship service as I'm doing what I've been created to do, which is to worship my Creator, to hear His word and to respond to it in worship. And so I'm not saying you're sinful if you check your text during the worship service, or you have your Bible on your phone and that's what you use. I'm just saying for me in this particular season, that's been a really good way for me to recognize and become more aware of that, and to become aware of, well, why is it in the middle of worship that I'm actually kind of tempted when my phone buzzes? What does that actually say about my heart at that point that I would let that even a little bit distract me, right? And so it's just a way to draw my awareness into it. Now, will I keep that rule forever? I don't know, probably not, but I still just like to live life away from my phone and disobey the phone. But it's not for everybody, but being aware, and we do that with our kids too. Like my 12-year-old, he loves screens and he loves commercials. We have like a show on, and it's like, hey man, you got to go to bed. And he'll be like going up the stairs, and the show will switch to a commercial, and he's like a deer in headlights. It doesn't matter what the commercial's for. And so like with him, I try to draw his awareness to that. And I say, Jack, I want you to grow up to be a man who can be happy not looking at screens.
Right.
And I want to like build for him a sense of not just, oh, you can't do this, but help him see, hey, there's actually a goodness here that that you're going to miss if you always take that trade-off. You need to guard those things. So do I do that perfectly? Not at all. Do I draw my awareness or my children's awareness to all of those things? No, but trying to do that some helps.
So you mentioned a word rule. You've got a rule. You're not taking your phone into worship if you can remember to do it. There's a couple people that have written books here recently kind of recommending types of rules for how to live faithfully as a Christian. So you think John Mark Comer has recently written a book where he talks about this, or Justin Earley has written The Common Rule. What do you think about kind of this idea of having certain types of rules that will affect our life and our spiritual health, just given the context that we live in?
Yeah. I think that it can be helpful, but again, you have to remember why. Like, first of all, I mean, we all know that we should not be legalistic, right? So it's easy to say that, but then as soon as you make yourself a rule, it's really easy to start being legalistic because we like systems, we like to obey rules, and we like to break rules. Yeah, so I think you have to be aware of just the types of things that rules make possible, but also the types of things that rules make tempting. And so I think in the realm of technology, you have to say, what area do you have stewardship in? And if you want to apply rules to a time to your area of stewardship, hey, have at it. But think about why, and don't judge other people for those rules. So for me, like I said, with worship, that's just me. Like if my wife has her texts come on her watch, and sometimes in worship they'll pop up and she has make them go away. I don't make her have the rule I have, right?
Sure.
My oldest has a cell phone. And I've talked to him about that. Like I don't want to see you have that out in church. So my area of dominion at this point, he's my 14-year-old. I can give him that rule. In my classroom, I tell students I don't want to see your phone in the room, not just during class time, but in the class space. Because if you come 5 minutes early, I don't want you to spend those 5 minutes trying to connect with somebody who's not there because you're not comfortable connecting with people who are there, because 5 years from now, you're going to be ignoring someone else to connect with people who are in this room right now. So again, that's within now do I say that's everybody's class? Do I judge faculty who don't have that rule? No.
Sure.
It's my rule. It's my rule for a reason, and I try to help those in my sphere of influence understand the rationale behind the rule, because what I don't want is my children or my students to think, oh, the path of discipleship is just about hitting the right rules.
Right.
No, rules can be tools when we think about them carefully and we think again about we are being made into the image of Christ. How might this way of limiting myself voluntarily aid in that through God's grace and God's work? And at what point might it start cutting the other way and actually be a detriment? So it requires both.
Yeah, that's good. Let me ask this. What are some ways, just as individuals, I mean, you've already mentioned something like not taking your phone in, but as individuals and Christian communities, that we can kind of fight against these temptations, just as a whole? What are some things that you think, and these are good practices? And just to start us off, you mentioned at the end of your book, Transhumanism, you actually list some of these. You talk about things like common meals together and Sabbath, solitude, and things like that. But just talk a little bit about those types of things in terms of what we can do to fight against.
Yeah, I think that part of what we have to do to fight against it is maybe look at things that have been common Christian practices for a really long time and say, how do I describe those? What positive do I see that's happening there? What is the good that the community over time seems to have promoted and centered itself around? And in what ways might that good be lost in our age? And then how can we try to guard that good in some way? So sometimes that means saying, hey, we're not going to have phones at the table or something, right? Because we recognize that there's something deeply human about sharing a meal together. There's just something, I mean, even having donuts in the back there, right? It's a different meeting because of the donuts. There's something about sharing a meal together that is deeply human and intimate in an important way. And Christian communities have always seen that. And so, and even like we can joke about the potluck. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the illustrations I use in the book. We can joke about the potluck because like sometimes potluck food's not that good. Some of you are probably young enough that you've never been to a potluck because churches don't do them anymore.
Let's see a show of hands. How many have never been to a potluck?
Okay. All right. So potluck, everybody brings a dish to share. Okay, good. You got the logic of it. But there's something about bringing out of the bounty of your home to share with others. And yeah, it can be weird, especially once everybody just starts bringing KFC or whatever. You've kind of lost the point of the potluck at that point. But there's something lost there. And I don't think that means that every church needs to go back to, hey, we're going to have the potluck. But I think we do have to say, how do we fellowship together? Like our church has a Wednesday night meal that they started up again a few years ago. Some people eat the meal that's there. Some people bring their own food, and it just creates a space for there to be table fellowship. And it's just something different. Some people every Sunday go out to eat and invite other people to go with them. And there's something about that that's still caught there. So I think we just have to be aware of those things. And we get these things can happen in surprising ways if we don't think about it. Here's an example of this. 25 years ago, if you were in a Sunday school class or a small group, whatever, they probably were just called Sunday school classes 25 years ago.
Yes, definitely.
And there was going to be a prayer need or something, like every self-respecting Sunday school class had a prayer train or prayer chain or something like that, which was a list of everybody in the Sunday school class with the phone number and an order. So I knew if I had a prayer request, I'd call kind of the point person, and it would go through the whole thing, and everybody would find out about it. And like if I got called, like if you called me, I would hear about it. I'd say, oh, pray. And then my job was like, call Benjamin, let him know, right? Takes a long time. Some of you are thinking, oh, surely there's an app for that now. Yeah, there is. My Sunday school class a few years ago started using this app for this very purpose. I, at the time, did not have a smartphone. I'm out. I don't get the prayer request. I have to ask my wife. And there's also, so it's not just that you've now made participation in the smartphone economy required to hear the prayer requests of the people in your Sunday school class,
Right.
but you've also changed the ecosystem of how prayer requests are shared. Because when I call Benjamin to tell him about the prayer request, I'm not just like, yo man, pray for Susie, bye. No, there's going to be a little bit of a conversational exchange there, one that even in small ways deepens our relationship, and over time deepens our relationship significantly. And that's lost in this app where we just float the prayer request out there. It shows up on everybody's phone as a notification that looks the same as your Facebook notification, as your doctor's office notification, as your missed call notification. And then all of a sudden, not only you're not talking to anybody, but now from how you look at your phone, those numbers are kind of all equal. Are they all of the same importance? They're all alerts. So there's just all these things that when you stop and think about it, and I'm pretty sure when my Sunday school teacher said we're going to use this app, he was not intending to make me upset. He doesn't like me in the class. You don't want a theologian in your Sunday school class, right? It's tough. But just having that happen to me made me think like, why does this rub me the wrong way? Because it irritated me. And as I thought about it more, I think I found some good reasons to be irritated along with the bad ones. There are bad ones too, but we have to learn to look for those things. I mean, one of the ways that we've seen this in post-COVID is, every church has said, hey, there are people who were connected to our church that have never reconnected after COVID. Mm-hmm. And that's because for whatever those people thought they were getting out of church, they think they're still getting by tuning into a live stream sometimes. Surely there's more to what most of our churches are doing than what can be conveyed in a live stream. Let's hope. And so I think that forces us to think about those trade-offs and to honestly say, man, how bad were we doing serving this brother if he really thinks it's the same sitting at home, tuning in? How does that change the way we think about ministry? How does that change the way we think about using those tools to get the gospel message out while at the same time recognizing that it can't be the only way to get the gospel message out, things like that.
Right. That person has obviously never considered the fact that they're a severed toe just laying there on the floor, right? Yeah.
And they probably need potluck food.
That's exactly
You know.
right. So you've written a book on spiritual formation and the image of God and transhumanism. Tell us just a little bit about what that idea is, because I'll be honest, that was, for me, when I first came across that term, it was a really unfamiliar idea. So would you mind just sharing a little bit about what that is when you talk about it?
Yeah, so transhumanism is a really broad movement, but it basically, transhumanists argue that we're at a point now where we can take control of human evolution, so it's built on an evolutionary approach. We just happen to be where we are in the stage of evolution. We can take control of it now, so let's take control of it and let's decide what we want to be. We can fix all of our problems with a combination of technology and drugs, so let's do it. The reason that I got interested in studying transhumanism, it really wasn't an interest in transhumanism at all. It was an interest in moral formation. And it's for exactly the reason that you said. When you hear that, you don't think, oh, that's for me.
Yeah.
Sign me up, right? And at least at the time when I was beginning this research, the vast majority of Christians would respond that way. It would say, oh, no, there was still an ick factor. There's now like a whole Christian transhumanist association, folks trying to bring them together. We're just going to leave that to the side. But for most of us, you hear that and you think, I don't want to become a robot. I don't even have a robot vacuum. There's still a factor to it. But when I studied transhumanism and really the logic behind it and the heart behind it, if you will, I found it's basically just modern enlightenment. You can do it. You can be whatever you want to be, combined with really fast computer chips and really strong drugs. And so the way most Christians uncritically interact with technology, we do it in the very same ways and for the very same reasons that transhumanists do. So the angle of the book was really, you don't think you're interested in transhumanism, but you actually probably are more so than you think you are already. And if you keep doing what you're doing for the next 20 years, it's not going to seem so weird.
Right.
Right. I mean, how many of you have interacted with some kind of virtual assistant on a website that's like, hi, I'm Bob, your virtual assistant. How can I help you? That would have freaked me out 15 years ago, right? And you might think, well, I never want to have a fake AI friend that I go to with my deepest challenges and troubles. Well, you know what? You're dealing with the AI bot on the website that's telling you, what size of shoe you might need. And that's getting you just a little more comfortable with this notion of interacting with an artificial intelligent, essentially robot. And so it's those sorts of things where we are being formed, our expectations, our thinking about what is good, our thinking about what relationships are, all of that is constantly being nudged. And so the point of the book was, if you don't think you want to be a transhumanist, think more carefully about all of it now. And that doesn't mean don't talk to an AI bot on a website or something. You don't have to be that extreme. But I do think that it forces us to, again, think about what are the trade-offs? What is communication? What are relationships? One of the things with ChatGPT, as I've dealt with that in the setting at the college, is we might think we know why students use ChatGPT. There's obviously the big reason, students in here, you can cheat that way, right? We all know that you just want to cheat. That's all you care about. I'm just teasing. That's like the low-hanging fruit of ChatGPT. Obviously, it can be dangerous because it can be used to cheat. And a lot of professors want to think about it primarily that way first. How do we make sure students aren't cheating? But as I studied some of the student response to ChatGPT kind of nationally, there were some quotes that really struck me. And one of them was a student saying, ChatGPT is like a really good, really smart mentor who's never annoyed by the questions you ask. And I quoted that to our faculty and I said, see, this shows us that maybe we're not as good at welcoming students into our offices and answering their questions as we think they are, or as we think we are, right? Because part of the attraction to this is this person won't get annoyed with me.
Wow.
Right? And so, again, there are these opportunities to recognize the way that seemingly neutral or just new out there things do nudge and shape us again, not just morally shape us, but spiritually shape us because of the types of beings that we are.
So just kind of going off this idea of annoyance. Like we know at our heart we don't want to be those people who display that to the student that comes to us, to the youth that we're working with as a youth pastor, to the elderly lady in our church who comes to us if we're pastoring or anything like that. At the same time, we do display that. So what are some ways, just given the reality of everything's fast-paced, everything's wanted in an instant, how in that reality can we kind of cultivate hope and joy and peace in the light of just this massive overhaul in what life is like now?
That's a big question. I probably don't have a satisfactory answer to it. But I think one maybe counterintuitive way is to rest in our limitations. I can't answer every student in the world's question in a patient and kind way, but most of the time I can answer the ones that do come to me on a given day. And so I think that we have to realize, but like what oftentimes I'm being sold is, if I organize my life in such a way, I can jam more in. And I think that's in so much stuff, and we just have to realize that that's, first of all, it's a lie, because you can't fit an infinite amount of stuff in. Right. And second of all, that's not good news. Like, you might think like the answer to your problem in life is that you need to become more productive, but that's probably not. It's probably not it. God has called you to serve. God has called you to do. God has called you to be faithful. And sometimes we can feel like we're not good enough unless we do more. And technology can promise us to help us do more. But part of the answer is actually saying, no, there's something that's enough, right? Like we could go into Proverbs here. Dr. Quinn's here. There are two things that are never satisfied, 3 that never say enough, right? Those aren't good things. The point of those verses is not, I want to become someone who's never satisfied and who never says enough. No, we recognize in that when we observe the world that there is something about satisfaction. There is something about learning to say enough. And so I think part of the way that we find hope and joy and peace is recognize that we are being bombarded by lies that more is always better. And it's not. In some ways it is, yes, but not always. And so when do we say enough? And even when it comes to the ministries that we're in and the ways we're pouring our lives out to serve the church, genuinely pouring our lives out, but there still comes a spot where enough.
That's a good word.